Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? While I was overseas, serving my country and counting the days until I could come home, my brother was slowly weaving himself into the empty space I left behind, until one day that space was no longer mine at all but his, and the man I thought I still had waiting for me was standing at his side instead of mine. When I finally came back, proud of what I had survived and expecting at least some recognition for the sacrifices I made, I walked straight into a living room where the words, "We didn't mean for it to happen," rolled off their tongues as if they were confessing to nothing more than breaking a glass, and my parents sat there watching me carefully, like referees trying to keep me from throwing the first punch at a game I had never agreed to play. I should have exploded, I should have screamed, I should have done the dramatic thing you see in movies where the betrayed woman slams the door and shatters the wine glass against the wall, but instead I froze, because the whole time they were talking about love and destiny. And finding what feels right, I realized I wasn't in a conversation, I was in a performance that had been rehearsed for weeks without me, and the only part left for me was the villain who had to either forgive or storm out. My mother, with that carefully soft voice of hers, leaned in and said I should be the bigger person because family is family, and my father nodded, already checking the clock as if he had other things to do once my little tantrum was over. Do you know what happens inside your chest when you understand that the people who raised you aren't even shocked at the betrayal? They're just nervous about how you might react? It's like your ribs tighten until you can't draw a full breath, and your heartbeat is so loud you wonder if they can hear it, but you force yourself to stay calm because you know deep down that the second you lose control they win the argument. So I sat there, stone still, and I said nothing, because silence has a weight they didn't expect. And while they were filling the air with words about forgiveness and new chapters, I was already planning something entirely different. I was going to protect myself, my money, my records, and my future before I even gave them the satisfaction of knowing how much I hurt. That night, instead of crying into a pillow, I pulled up every account I had, changed every password, redirected my direct deposit, and froze our joint credit line. Jason didn't even notice right away, which told me everything I needed to know about how little he had been contributing while I was gone. I also downloaded the shared cloud album we had used to store photos, because the thing about technology is that it doesn't lie. Every timestamp, every GPS tag, every just helping out shot of my brother and my husband together was right there. Sorted neatly by date, proving that what they called unexpected love had been brewing in my absence with full intention. The next morning, I walked into base legal and asked for advice, not tears. The officer looked me straight in the eye, told me what paperwork I would need if I wanted a clean separation, and reminded me to keep every message and voicemail because words said in the heat of the moment have a way of becoming valuable later. I left that office steadier than I had felt since stepping off the plane, because for the first time I had something they couldn't twist, proof and process. Later, when my parents invited me to what they called a forgive dinner, I politely declined. Instead, I wrote an email, calm, neutral, factual, summarizing exactly what had been said in that living room, who said it, and how I had been asked to forgive for the sake of family. I copied every person who had been there, not to accuse them, not to yell, but to lock the story into place where it could not be altered or softened by memory. When you put people's words into writing, they stop being slippery and start being shackles, and that was my first move toward control. So when I tell you that by the end of that first week I was not the woman who came home expecting hugs and banners, I mean it. I was the woman who realized that if I wanted peace, I would need to build it myself, brick by brick, out of paperwork and patience. They thought silence meant I was weak, but the truth is silence gave me time to prepare, and preparation is power. Tomorrow, I said to myself, I stop reacting and start designing, because they thought they had ended the story, but really, they had only handed me the pen. If there's one thing I learned quickly, it's that people who do something awful rarely tell the truth about it. They tell the version that makes them look brave, or helpless, or noble. Or like they were just responding to the universe with open hearts and unfortunate timing, and in my case, that version painted me as the cold, emotionally unavailable woman who had abandoned her husband for duty, while my brother, poor Noah, was just being supportive until the lines blurred and love found them. where no one expected it. That was the version they were already telling, not just behind my back, but straight to my face, as if I should feel lucky they were honest now. As if confessing meant they were heroes of integrity instead of two people who had crossed a line and never once thought about what it would do to me. It wasn't just Jason and Noah who were rewriting history either. My mother, ever the peace negotiator, began dropping little comments like, "Well, you were gone a long time, and relationships are complicated when people are apart for so long," as though I had gone on a 6-month spa retreat instead of a combat deployment. As though I had chosen to miss birthdays and anniversaries and Sunday brunches for the fun of it. My father, quieter but no less complicit, kept pushing the idea that everyone just needs time, like betrayal was a seasonal illness we could all just ride out if we bundled up and kept smiling. What they didn't realize was that I had no interest in playing the villain in their tragic romance script. I wasn't going to let them build some soft-focus narrative where I was the bitter ex-wife who just didn't understand the magic of fate. But I also knew that walking into a room and screaming the truth doesn't work. People tune out anger, they defend against confrontation, and worst of all, they rewrite even faster to justify their discomfort. So instead of rage, I chose rooms where words had weight. When they suggested therapy, a group session, just to clear the air, with a counselor they picked, I said yes, not because I expected some kind of breakthrough, but because I wanted everything said in that room to be documented, transcribed, and preserved by someone whose job was to notice patterns and write things down. And sure enough, the session went exactly how I predicted it would. Noah talked the most, filling the space with words like connection and organic, and we tried to fight it, while Jason sat there with his head bowed like a choir boy caught stealing communion wine, offering occasional soft murmurs about how he had felt abandoned and confused, and how Emma and I were already distant. My parents nodded solemnly, as if this sad little fairy tale explained everything, and I sat perfectly still, watching the therapist scribble notes, never once interrupting their rehearsed confessions. When the therapist finally turned to me and asked how I felt, I didn't cry or yell or even raise my voice. I said that I was less interested in feelings and more interested in facts, and the facts were that a betrayal had occurred, not once but repeatedly, with full knowledge and intent, and that I didn't need to forgive anyone just because the people who wronged me happened to share my last name. I said that moving forward, I wanted everything, every summary, every comment, every admission, to be included in the therapist's session notes and shared in writing, because I was done with whispered justifications and backroom storytelling. And then, 2 days later, I got the therapist's email. It was polite, professional, and devastating in its clarity. It outlined the key moments of the session, including Noah's acknowledgement that he had developed feelings for Jason months before I returned. Jason's quiet agreement that their relationship had already become emotionally significant before I landed, and my parents' shared belief that the affair was unfortunate but understandable, given the circumstances. I didn't add anything. I just forwarded the email to every person who had sat in that room, thanked the therapist for the transparency, and let the words, their words, sit there in their inboxes like time-stamped anchors they could never pull out of the ground again. But I wasn't finished. The next opportunity came at a small church meeting where my parents were active volunteers and Noah had recently become a beloved fixture thanks to his emotional journey and big heart. I didn't stand up and announce anything. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I simply waited for the right moment, a discussion about honesty and accountability, and asked, calmly and clearly, how people handle situations where someone you love does something you can't condone, but everyone else just wants to move on. The room went quiet, and I let it stay quiet, because the silence said more than any monologue ever could. Later, the church elder, a sharp woman who doesn't miss much, pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. I didn't give her details, but I did ask if she'd ever seen a family so determined to protect its own narrative that it crushed the truth in the process. She didn't answer. She just nodded slowly, like she already understood far more than she'd say out loud. So no, I didn't burn anything down. I didn't scream. I didn't slam doors or write angry posts or beg for sympathy. What I did was collect their stories, place them where they couldn't be changed, and let them float in the open where everyone could see how much the truth cost when it was finally told. They wanted forgiveness. Now they wanted silence. But I wasn't giving them either. Because the moment you try to silence someone who finally has the facts, that's the moment you lose control of the story. There's a point in every betrayal story where the people who hurt you stop pretending they didn't mean it and start pretending it wasn't that bad, and for me, that point came shortly after the therapist's summary hit their inboxes. Because instead of offering apologies or taking accountability, they pivoted to a new campaign, one centered entirely on damage control, subtle guilt tripping, and the increasingly desperate attempt to turn my insistence on clarity and consequences into evidence. That I was somehow bitter, cruel, or unwilling to let go of the past. But the irony, and I say this with no satisfaction, just cold observation, is that the more they tried to make me the problem, the more obvious it became that they were terrified of what would happen if the facts they had once freely admitted in a controlled, private environment suddenly became legally relevant, because they never expected me to do anything except absorb it, cry in private, and eventually agree to some family dinner where everything was healed by pretending nothing ever happened. What they didn't know is that I had already been quietly preparing for the next phase, not revenge in the dramatic sense, but something far more powerful, more permanent, and, frankly, more effective. I was going to convert everything they had said and done into legally actionable structure, and I was going to do it without yelling, without threats, and without giving them a single excuse to call me unstable or emotional. So while they were still trying to bait me into dramatic reactions, I booked a meeting with a mediator, not to negotiate some grand settlement, but to initiate what's known in legal terms as a structured separation process, one that would allow me to detach financially, logistically, and reputationally from the wreckage they had created. The first thing I did was have all assets and accounts reviewed, not because I thought Jason was hiding money, he wasn't smart enough for that, but because I needed a clear, documented picture of what belonged to whom, and more importantly, what could be frozen, split, or reassigned. The second thing I did was draft a property agreement, clean and minimal, no drama, just facts, dates, and conditions, including a buyout clause for the home we technically still co-owned, and a proposal for Jason to assume full responsibility for any remaining joint debts incurred during my deployment. And finally, I added a clause that my attorney suggested, one I didn't even know was possible until she brought it up, a non-disparagement clause with a penalty structure, meaning if Jason, or anyone acting on his behalf, attempted to smear me publicly or privately in any community, professional or social space, there would be documented financial consequences built into the agreement. I sent the proposal to Jason first, and predictably, he didn't respond directly. Instead, I got a call from my mother, who was now in full panic mode, accusing me of being vindictive and punishing and trying to ruin everyone's peace, which, of course, translated into, "We didn't expect you to actually draw lines. We expected you to just eventually cry yourself into acceptance." She asked, no, begged, that I not make things official, that I just come over and talk things through, as if clarity was the problem, as if putting anything in writing was a declaration of war. And I'll admit, for a split second, the old programming kicked in, the need to not be the difficult daughter, the temptation to fix everyone's discomfort by undoing the one thing giving me peace, but I shut that down fast, because I knew exactly what was happening. The second I removed their ability to narrate over me, I became dangerous, and their fear wasn't about the content of the documents, it was about the power shift those documents represented. Noah, of course, got involved next, calling me from a number I hadn't blocked yet, launching into one of his rehearsed monologues about how I was escalating everything unnecessarily, how everyone's hurting, and how this doesn't need to be a war. I let him speak, let him burn through his entire script, and then I asked him a single question. Do you deny that your relationship with Jason began before I returned home? He stammered, said something about emotional gray areas, and that was all I needed. I thanked him for confirming, reminded him that our conversation was now noted in my records, and ended the call. At that point, the silence was noticeable. The call stopped. The emails went quiet. And I knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot, but I had shifted the entire foundation of the situation. I wasn't the one defending myself anymore. I wasn't the one spinning. I wasn't playing catch-up to their narrative. I had locked the timeline in place, framed it with professional summaries, and now I was tying every future action to actual cost. You want peace? Sign. You want the house? Pay. You want to talk to me? Respect the boundary and accept the terms. I didn't need to threaten them. I just needed to make it clear that, from here on out, every action had a price tag, every insult triggered a clause, and every conversation would be treated like a transaction, not because I didn't care, but because caring had already cost me more than enough. Noah says I am destroying the family. I say, read clause 4. It's right there in the paperwork, the part where honesty is required, and spin comes with interest. By the time the paperwork was in motion and the tone had shifted from condescending pleas to cautious silence, I realized that I had arrived at the phase of the story where appearances mattered more to them than truth. Because when people like my family find themselves boxed into a corner where their behavior can no longer be rebranded as noble or misunderstood, they do what they've always done best: they pivot to reputation management. And suddenly it's not about what happened, but about who looks worse in the retelling. That's when I understood that while the legal structure gave me protection and the documented admissions gave me power, the next battle wasn't going to be in courtrooms or through mediation. It was going to unfold in the vague spaces between perception and reality, the places where people whisper, where community optics form, and where reputations are either preserved or quietly dismantled. I saw the shift begin subtly, in the way my name started disappearing from conversations with mutual friends, how people who once sent check-in texts suddenly stopped asking how I was doing. But were still very much involved in Jason and Noah's curated version of events, a version that painted me as cold, angry, overly rational, and unable to move on, while they leaned into phrases like, "It was complicated," and "No one meant to hurt anyone," with just enough emotion to make people forget that timing, intent, and deceit were not just messy side effects, but the entire architecture of their betrayal. And because they were counting on silence, my silence, to keep that version afloat, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I wasn't going to argue, I wasn't going to defend, and I wasn't going to give them a dramatic foil to make their performances more sympathetic. I was going to let their own words, the ones they said when they thought it was safe, speak for themselves, but this time in places they couldn't control. The first moment came when a former neighbor reached out to ask if I was okay, which I appreciated, until she followed it up with, "Jason says you two were already separating before you left for your deployment, and that things were basically over." That sentence hit harder than I expected, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I already suspected, that Jason, with his soft-spoken voice and carefully vague language, had been recasting the timeline just enough to make himself look like the wounded one, the man who had already been abandoned, the husband left behind. So instead of explaining or arguing or even correcting, I responded with a simple message: "Thank you for checking in. I'm doing well." Jason and I were not separated before deployment, and a licensed therapist's notes confirmed that the affair began before my return. I've chosen not to share details publicly, but I appreciate your concern. That was it. One text. Calm. Factual. And nuclear in its implications. What happened next confirmed that I had struck a nerve. Within days, Noah was talking to people in our parents' social circle, framing me as unstable and fixated on revenge, and more importantly, claiming that I was trying to destroy the family's image. And to that, I had only one response. I forwarded the therapist's summary, the same document I had already circulated privately, to the community mediator who had recently invited us to a church board dinner. I included no commentary, no dramatics, just the facts as professionally recorded, and a short message that said, "Since there are conflicting accounts being shared, I thought it would be helpful for leadership to have access to the record." That's it. One click. And suddenly the carefully constructed illusion of innocent confusion collapsed under the weight of their own admissions. But the real shift happened during what my mother insisted on calling our reconciliation meeting, an informal gathering at her house with just the family, where she said we could all talk like adults and put this behind us. I knew going in that it wasn't about reconciliation. It was about getting me to stop applying pressure, to stop documenting, to stop insisting on clarity. I arrived, sat down, listened as they begged, again, for me to let it go, and when my father said, "Do you really want your whole life to be defined by this bitterness?" I said, "No, that's why I'm ending it cleanly. On paper. With boundaries." Then I stood up, handed them each an envelope, and said, "This is not punishment. It's structure. If you want to be part of my life moving forward, these are the terms." Inside the envelope was a single page, a plain, simple acknowledgement form. No legal threats, no financial demands, just a statement affirming that they recognized the timeline of events as confirmed by the therapist, that they acknowledged harm was caused, and that they agreed to stop framing the situation as a misunderstanding. Signing it didn't require groveling or confession. It just required honesty. They didn't sign it. Not that day. Maybe not ever. But I left it with them and walked out without raising my voice. Later that week, I sent a note to the neighborhood board president thanking him for helping facilitate quiet move-out arrangements and for creating a buffer while I handled logistics. It wasn't performative, it was respectful. But it also ensured that the people in positions of influence had a full, clear picture of who was handling this with maturity and who was trying to rewrite history. My mother said I was forcing a confession. I said I was requiring truth. There's a difference. One demands pain. The other demands clarity. And if they couldn't offer it voluntarily, I had already learned how to extract it, not with yelling, not with threats, but with silence, paper, and the slow, deliberate placement of their own words into hands that mattered. Because sometimes, the most devastating thing you can do to someone who lies is nothing more than letting the tape play. There's something both liberating and quietly brutal about reaching the point where you no longer need people to admit they were wrong in order for you to move on, where you've already carved out enough peace for yourself that their silence, their denials, their half-apologies and shifting stories no longer have the power to reroute your life. And when that moment arrived for me, it didn't come with tears or applause or some dramatic crescendo. It came in the form of a signed wire transfer. From Jason's lawyer, transferring my half of the home equity into a freshly opened account under my name alone, followed by a quiet notarized agreement that finalized the division of every shared asset down to the smallest recurring charge. That was it. No handshake. No closure. Just numbers in a line and a signature on a line and the faint clicking sound of a chapter locking itself behind me. I moved out on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after that final reconciliation meeting, and the house that had once been mine, the one I'd painted, furnished, and come home to after my deployment with some vague hope that it would still be mine, was no longer my problem. I didn't slam the door or leave a note or take anything I didn't own outright. I didn't need to. They had already given me everything I needed, not out of guilt or redemption, but out of the slow, mounting realization that I wasn't going to flinch, I wasn't going to cave, and I wasn't going to sit quietly in the corner while they repackaged betrayal as miscommunication. And once that realization settled in, once it became clear that I wasn't bargaining with emotions, but with facts, documents, and boundaries that didn't bend no matter how many times they tried to appeal to nostalgia or shame or bloodlines, they folded, because they had nothing left to push against. What people don't understand until they live it is that the aftermath of betrayal is not rage, not grief, not even revenge, it's redefinition. You have to rebuild not just the structures around you, but the definition of who you are, what you will tolerate, and what family actually means when you strip away the Hallmark nonsense and the Instagram filters. And for me, that redefinition began with a simple but unbreakable rule: access to me, to my time, my energy, my home, my holidays, my presence, would no longer be automatic just because someone shares my last name or once changed my diapers or happens to cry when cornered. From now on, access would be earned, and that access would live inside a structure I designed, not a guilt script they handed down. So I created something I called the door. Not literally, but in practice, a single email account, a shared calendar, and a digital form. It wasn't legalese or dramatic. It was just structure. The calendar marked family events, and if they wanted me there, they had to send a request, not groveling, just an acknowledgement of boundaries. The form included 3 questions. Have you minimized the betrayal in the last 90 days? Have you attempted to rewrite the timeline in conversation with others? Have you acknowledged the harm caused to the person you're requesting access to? If the answer to any of those was no, then the access was paused. No yelling. No confrontation. Just a quiet lock on the door until the criteria were met. My parents, predictably, were horrified. My mother called it clinical and cold. My father said it felt like I was treating them like strangers, which, in a way, I was, because strangers are expected to earn trust, not be granted it unconditionally. Noah didn't bother responding at all, which told me everything I needed to know about his sense of entitlement. Jason sent one final text, saying he hoped I'd eventually heal enough to see this differently, and I didn't even reply. Healing, to him, meant folding. To me, it meant standing all the way up. The holidays came and went, and for the first time in years, I spent them in a space that felt entirely mine. No tense dinners, no whispered negotiations in the kitchen, no fake laughter over stuffing and cranberry sauce while resentment boiled under the surface. Just me, a few friends, and a peace so deep I could feel it in my bones. I didn't miss them. I didn't check in. I didn't wonder if I had gone too far. I knew exactly how far I had gone, just far enough to build a life they couldn't contaminate. And then, sometime in the quiet of late January, my mother sent an email through the door. She answered all 3 questions honestly. She acknowledged the timeline. She said she regretted defending the indefensible. She didn't ask to be absolved. She just asked for a conversation. I didn't respond right away. I sat with it. I thought about everything I had lost and everything I had gained, and then I wrote back a single sentence. When you're ready to talk about it without trying to fix how I feel, I'm willing to listen. That was it. Not an invitation. Not a guarantee. Just a door, cracked open, not for nostalgia, not for reconciliation, but for honesty. Because that's the difference between forgiveness and access. Forgiveness can be personal, internal, something you do without ever speaking to the person again. Access is something you control, something you gate, something you require proof of readiness for. And I had built that gate so carefully, so intentionally, that now, even if they begged, even if they changed, even if they truly felt remorse, the rules wouldn't bend. They would walk through them, or they wouldn't, and either way, I would be fine. I don't know if they'll ever come all the way through. I don't know if Noah will ever even try. I don't know if Jason will ever understand the difference between being sorry and being sorry you got caught. But I do know this, I'm not waiting anymore. I'm not watching the door. I'm not hoping for anything. Because the win isn't that they apologized. The win is that they lost access and I didn't have to raise my voice once. The win is that I turned the tables without flipping them over. The win is that I wrote the ending not with rage, not with revenge, but with a rule: tell the truth or stay outside. And if they ever choose to tell it the whole truth, not just the version that makes them look better, they'll find the door still there. Not wide open, not welcoming, but unlocked. Just enough for the truth to come in. And nothing else.